In this video, we are going to look at how we can use proportions to calculate different values involving percents. So if we want to know what percent of a number is 25% of that number, or what percent of 200 is 50, we'll be able to look at different calculations we can do to figure that out. But to start off, first we just want to make sure that we're comfortable with some of the percentage vocabulary and how we're going to use that to relate numbers together. The key thing to remember here is that of always means multiplication. So before, if I had two groups of 8, the of indicates that we're going to multiply, and here we would do 2 times 8. It's going to be the same thing with these percents. So we want to know what is 25% of $34. So I'm going to take 25% and I'm going to multiply it by $34. Except now we want to think about how we can use this percent, because right now the numbers aren't in the same form. I've got a percent and essentially a decimal here. Before we can do anything with the percent, we have to take it and turn it into a decimal. Remember that we do this using our D2P rule. So if I have my percent and I want to turn it into a decimal, I move 2 spaces to the left. My decimal point, if it's not written, starts right by the percent sign, so we move 2 spaces to the left. So now we have 0.25 times $34. And I can use my calculator for this, and we just type it in, 0.25 times 34, and we get 8.5. And now since our problem involved money, we want to make our answer look like money. So we'd use our dollar sign, and we'd add the extra 0 on at the end. If we wanted to set the second one up, we can do exactly the same thing. We read our question, what is 70% of 120 people? That of right away tells me that I'm going to be multiplying. So I have 70% times 120. Then we need to take our percent and turn it into a decimal. It's always going to be 2 spaces to the left. So we count 2 spaces, and we're going to have 0.70 times 120. And when we do that, again, we type it into the calculator, make sure we type it in correctly, and we get 84, and here our label was people. Go ahead and pause the video and see if you can solve the other 2 questions. Alright, so now if we take a look at these, if we look at our first one, we set it up exactly the same way. 15% of means multiply, 280. 0.15 after we do the conversion times 280, we get 42 voters. The last one's interesting because our percent is actually greater than 100. So think about it if you got 110% on a test. That means you got more points than normal. You got that extra credit. So you had more than the total number of points. So I'm going to end up with an answer that's greater than 50 points because of that extra credit. When we take our 110% and turn it onto a decimal, unlike all the other ones where our decimal ended up completely to the left of the number, here our decimal is in between 2 digits, so we don't get all the way back to a number less than 1. We actually end up with 1.10 for our percent once we convert it. We multiply that by 50 and we get 55 points, which makes sense because we had those 5 bonus points to get us our score over 100%. When we talk about percents, we're talking about special ratios. So this unit is all about ratios and proportions. And when we think about percents, we're thinking about a denominator of 100. So you think about the base percent when you're thinking about a test. If there's no extra credit, the best that you can get is 100%. So if I'm talking about a percent, say 86%, 72%, 54%, that's always out of the 100 possible percents. And we're going to set up a proportion to represent this. In our proportion, we are always going to have this part on the right-hand side. That 100 will be there every single time we write this proportion because we always know the percents are out of 100 total possible percentage points. Now, sometimes we'll have the percent in the top, sometimes we won't. These other 2 pieces are the part and the whole, and this is where we like to think about pizza. So if I have this whole pizza, I count up 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 slices. So in the whole pizza, I have 8 slices. But say I'm splitting this with 4 friends and I get my part of the pizza. My part is those 2 slices. If I wanted to figure out what percent I was getting of the pizza, I take my part, which is 2 slices, out of 8 total, and I set that equal to some mystery percent, because that's what we're solving for, over 100. And now this looks exactly like the proportions we've spent the last week or so working with. We cross multiply, so we have 2 times 100, which is 200, equals, and we'll change this to our variable, 8 times x. Then we divide both sides by 8, and we'll get our final answer, which is going to be 25 equals x. So we have 25%. Now we're going to take a look at the typical problems that we might see with this, and every single time we're going to set up a proportion and we're going to solve. We're going to follow this template, which is very similar to the part to whole that we saw on the last page with the percent over 100. We can think of part to whole or is and of kind of as our word ratio, because we're going to use clues like the labels in the past to figure out which numbers go in these slots. So our first question is that 10% of what number is 70? So I start with my percent over 100 and my is and of. Then we start looking for the different pieces in the problem. So I have 10%. So when I set up my proportion, I know that I'm going to have this 100 here every single time, so we can even go and do it for the next one without even reading the problem. Next, we just read through and fill in numbers where they go. So we have 10%, so 10 goes with the 100. Next we have of what number. So remember, anytime we see that number, that's where the x is going to go. So we have an of, this means this is our variable. I look here, of is in the bottom, so I have x in the denominator. Then we keep going down the line. We have is 70. Anytime I see is, this is going to go in the numerator. So we have 70. We're saying that 70 is part of this greater whole. Then we go through and solve our proportion, just like we've done before. We cross multiply, so we have 70 times 100. Then on the other side, we have 10 times x, or 10x. So now we just go through, set up our equation, and solve. Pause the video and see if you can find the value of x. Alright, now we take a look, we see we get 700 as our answer. We can kind of use common sense too to think about what this answer might be. I know that in 100%, I have 10 groups of 10%. So if I take 70 and multiply it by 10, because it's 10%, we get that answer of 700. Let's try and set up the next one. We start with our 100 in the bottom. That's the easy part, so I've already filled it in. We have what percent. So now I don't know the percent. The what is the keyword that I'm going to use my variable here. So we put our variable over 100. Then we keep going. We have of 200. So of is in the denominator because that's the bigger whole that we're talking about. And then we have the is 15. This is our part. So 15 is part of 200. We want to figure out what part exactly. Let's go ahead and pause the video and see if you can solve that proportion for x. Alright, we cross multiply. We have x times 200, which is 200x, 15 times 100, which is 1500. We divide both sides by 200, and we get our final answer of 7.5. Now, since they are asking what percent, I need to make sure that I express my answer as a percent. And so our final answer is 7.5%. Go ahead, pause the video, and try each of these problems to see if you've got it. Go ahead and check your work. If we look at the first one, we have 45 is, so that goes in the numerator. We have 60%, so that goes over 100. Of what number means that we have an x in the denominator. We get an answer of 75. So we know that 45 is 60% of this number. 60% is a little more than 50, so it should be a little more than half of the number. So if 45 was exactly half of the number, our answer would be 90. But since it's a little more than half, it's 60%, we know our answer is going to be less than 90. So 75 makes sense as a reasonable answer. If we look at the second problem, we had what is. So what means we're going to have our variable. Is means it's in the numerator, but not above 100 because that's where the percent goes. So it's on the other side. We have 74%, so we have 74 in the numerator of the fraction with the 100 down below. and then of 650, which means our other denominator is going to be 650. We get a final answer of 481 after we solve that proportion. And we can kind of use, again, common sense here. I know that 74% is greater than half of the number. So if I think about 650 divided by 2, we're going to get 325. So I know that my answer has to be bigger than 325, which it is. So we know that we did it correctly. The key is to remember this template, and if you fill that in, the problems are exactly the same as the proportions that we've spent the last week or so solving, and you can definitely handle that.